The world is astonished when Brian Wilson's ex-wife speaks out after his death. The world burst into homage on June 11, 2025, when Brian Wilson closed his eyes for the last time. Good feelings were played often by radio stations. Paul McCartney referred to him as the greatest innovator in music. One voice, however, has stayed silent up to this point in this symphony of remembering. For more than 45 years, Marilyn Ravel, Brian's first wife and a witness to both his creative peak and tragic collapse, had kept quiet about their relationship. Then, a few days after his death, she took an unexpected action. Her handwritten note would permanently alter our perception of the greatest tortured talent in music. This wasn't just another famous ex-wife looking for attention, delivered privately to their daughters instead than being marketed to newspapers. Marilyn's letter contains intimate revelations that change our perception of the man who makes pet noises. After realizing that no one from the outside could help Brian from the tumultuous environment he was drowning in, she wrote, "I used to hope Brian would overcome it." Not only does she break decades of silence, but her words also highlight the stark contrast between Wilson's sun-drenched California melodies and the psychological darkness that consumes him, which is what makes her timing so extraordinary. The most startling aspect of his account is not what Marilyn wrote, but rather why she vanished from it so thoroughly for almost 50 years. She had seen something far more unsettling, a great mind crumbling before her eyes, while the rest of the world rejoiced over a musical genius. Here are 5 startling facts regarding Brian Wilson's unspoken problems before we go any further. Wilson frequently wrote Beach Boys songs in the studio while sobbing hysterically. He occasionally heard someone critiquing his music in the middle of a concert. He would labor for 20 hours straight while recording pet sounds, and then spend days in bed. During sessions, the studio musicians were told not to look him in the eye. When he was still married to Marilyn, he once went 3 years without leaving his bedroom. The letter that made all the difference. 6 days after the music industry was rocked by Brian Wilson's death, his daughter, Carney Wilson, received a handwritten 2-page letter at her house. His first wife, and the mother of his daughters, Marilyn Ravel Wilson, is the sender. It was not only the date of this correspondence that was remarkable, but its very existence. Marilyn had been completely silent about Brian on the radio since their divorce in 1979. No documentaries, no memoirs, no interviews, nothing. She seemed to have completely removed herself from his story. The letter was composed when Brian's health was fast declining, but it was sent on June 5th, which was astonishingly 6 days before his death. "I was deeply in love with Brian. I saw the breakdown of a person in one passage that only he could completely comprehend. This was no resentful ex-wife out for vengeance. A chapter that had been written out of Brian's public narrative was finally acknowledged with this." During her father's funeral, Carney carried the letter with her. Parts were read out in a private family gathering following the ceremony, not for publicity, but as a last admission of reality. Too agonizing to discuss while Brian was still living. Marilyn's straightforward yet heartbreaking appraisal of Brian, whose musical discoveries transformed popular culture, while his personal reality collapsed, was the most illuminating. She described Brian as a soul who couldn't live in reality. 1962's The Adolescent Bride Who Saw Genius. The Beach Boys were just starting to gain popularity when 19-year-old Brian Wilson met the Honey's 15-year-old Marilyn Ravel. Murray, Brian's domineering father, opposed their union, but they were married in December 1964. At the age of 22, Brian was already exhibiting the mental health issues that would come to define his life, while Marilyn was just 17. Brian's most creative phase, when he stopped touring to concentrate solely on studio production, coincided with their marriage. During this time, he revolutionized recording processes and expanded the possibilities of pop music. Marilyn was observing something quite different at home, while America fell in love with the upbeat optimism of Beach Boys songs. The same imaginative brain that created California Girls was increasingly afflicted with debilitating anxiety, paranoia, and auditory hallucinations. Marilyn observed Brian's increasingly unpredictable conduct throughout the 1966 recording of Pet Sounds, which is now regarded as one of the best albums ever produced. Days would pass while he worked frantically in the studio before collapsing into their bed. "Do you still think I'm real? They weren't just tunes, Caroline. They were pleas for assistance masquerading as lovely tunes." The birth of their daughters, Carney and Wendy, in 1968 and 1969 did not calm Brian down. It sped up his demise, if anything. By the time the grandiose Smile project fell through, Marilyn was successfully parenting their girls by herself and dealing with a husband who occasionally refused to leave his bedroom for weeks at a time. She wrote, "Brian wasn't simply slipping away from me. He was beginning to lose himself. As my spouse vanished into a mind that had turned against him, I watched." From spouse to guardian. Marilyn had changed from being a wife to a full-time caregiver by the early 1970s. From occasional LSD, Brian's drug use progressed to cocaine, amphetamines, and excessive alcohol consumption. He spent days in bed, eating obsessively, and his weight grew. Once in charge of every element of the Beach Boys' sound, the creative genius was unable to govern his own fundamental processes. She wrote, "There were days when I had to dress him physically. Food would be left beside the bed, and when I came back, it was still there. At times, he would spend hours gazing at the ceiling, certain that the air conditioner was sending him signals." In addition to taking care of Brian's illness during this time, Marilyn was shielding their young girls from the true extent of their father's condition. How do you explain to a 5-year-old that his mind is telling him horrible things, which is why he is in bed? In her letter, she inquired, "How can you explain such sorrow to a child?" The situation had gotten intolerable by the middle of the 1970s. In a desperate attempt to help Brian function, the family turned to controversial therapist Dr. Eugene Landy, whose techniques eventually resulted in yet another kind of abuse and control. She was erased by the divorce. After over 15 years of marriage, there were no tabloid wars, arguments about Brian's musical fortune, or revealing interviews when Marilyn eventually filed for divorce in 1979. She just left, not just the marriage, but Brian's story in its entirety. Marilyn vanished into private life, while Brian stayed in the spotlight and finally came under the whole authority of Eugene Landy. She never traded on her relationship with Brian or the Beach Boys, instead concentrating on raising Carney and Wendy. Not only was this total separation out of the ordinary, it was unprecedented. The majority of well-known musicians' ex-spouses continued to have some public connections. None of these things were done by Marilyn. She remained completely silent about Brian Wilson for more than 45 years. Finally, she explains why in her letter. "A marriage was not being left behind when Brian left. I had to admit that I couldn't save someone who was drowning in his own thoughts. Making a total break was the only way I could keep our girls and myself safe. This separation was so complete that Marilyn did not publicly congratulate Brian on his 1995 marriage to Melinda Ledbetter, his second wife. She didn't show up when he received Lifetime Achievement Awards. She turned down every interview request while movies on his life were being filmed. Decided that the day I left, my life with Brian was over. She wrote because maintaining any kind of connection would have kept me orbiting around someone who had fallen into himself like a dying star, not because she was angry or resentful." The second savior. Even though Marilyn stayed out of Brian's life, Melinda Ledbetter's entrance in 1986 changed everything. Brian Wilson legend has it that they met at a Cadillac store where Melinda worked. The car salesman saw something unique in the struggling musician. Brian was still being controlled by Eugene Landy at the time. From Brian's nutrition and medication to his finances and artistic choices, the contentious therapist had effectively taken over every part of his life. Melinda saw right through this exploitation. She painstakingly documented Landy's actions over a number of years, assembling a case that ultimately led to a court order. Landy and Brian parted ways for good in 1991. Brian's marriage to Melinda in 1995 signaled the start of a new type of stability in his life. He finished and released Smile almost 40 years after he had abandoned it, went on tour once more, and got the critical acclaim his inventions merited under Melinda's care. This chapter is acknowledged with surprising grace in Marilyn's letter. I appreciated that Melinda was able to give Brian what he needed in ways that I was unable to. She came into his life with different resources and at a different period. I knew a different Brian than the one she married. By that time, the broken young father and the talented young composer were both dead. This admission shows a deep comprehension of how Brian's illness influenced his relationships in various ways over time. The last chapter. Marilyn's letter's most moving disclosure relates to the time following Melinda's passing in early 2024. Marilyn disclosed that, despite her decades-long estrangement, she had been surreptitiously keeping an eye on Brian's health through family ties. I realized right away what it would mean for Brian when I learned of Melinda's death, she wrote. I worried that without her to keep him grounded, he would lose all sense of reality. Tragically, this forecast came to pass. Brian's health quickly declined when Melinda passed away. His dementia progressed rapidly. Family sources claim that he often asked for Melinda and frequently forgot that she had passed away. Marilyn disclosed in a particularly poignant section that she had, in fact, written a letter to Brian himself at this time, one that was sent to his house, but that he probably never understood because of his illness. I wanted him to know that I still valued the years we spent together in spite of everything. The circle that started when the Beach Boys first met as teenagers was closed when this letter was set on the piano, where Brian had written the band's first hits. The last hush was shattered. Following Brian Wilson's death on June 11, 2025, there was an immediate and worldwide public grief. Legends of music paid their respects. Beach Boys marathons were aired on radio stations. The woman who had witnessed the beginning and the breaking moment, however, discreetly wrote the most important response. Ultimately, she noted, Brian's music was the most obvious manifestation of his true self. Elegant, intricate, inventive, yet ultimately incapable of fitting into the frameworks of everyday existence. He was unable to live peacefully in the world that the rest of us live in, because of the same genius that gave him the ability to hear harmonies that no one else could. This revelation provides a significant reinterpretation of Brian Wilson's legacy, coming from the person who may have known him best at his most creative and turbulent time. His psychological anguish and artistic brilliance were integral components of the same remarkable mind, not distinct facets of his life. Marilyn's choice to speak out following Brian's passing, albeit in such a restricted and private manner, says a lot about her personality. She opted for seclusion and dignity for almost 50 years, in contrast to the many celebrity ex-partners who have made money out of their ties to well-known ex-partners. Her letter ended, I never stopped caring what happened to Brian, but I didn't want to be part of his story anymore. I hope he's finally found the harmony he could produce in music, but never fully experience in his thoughts, the calm that eluded him throughout his life, now that he's gone. Two worlds were bridged by the daughters, Carney and Wendy Wilson, who grew up negotiating the challenging realities of being Brian Wilson's daughters with little access to him as a father, were arguably the most significant beneficiaries of Marilyn's observations. With Wilson Phillips, both women went on to have successful musical careers, achieving enormous success with songs like Release Me and Hold On. By creating their own artistic identities and recognizing their father's brilliance, their accomplishment constituted a distinct kind of musical legacy. Carney has discussed in public the difficulties of having a father who suffers from a serious mental condition. She has recounted times when Brian appeared to look through his girls instead of at them, including Christmas mornings when he stayed in bed and was unable to join in family festivities. Marilyn's letter provided them with background information and a better comprehension of the man who had been lost to them, in part due to his illness. Not for publicity, but as a final acknowledgement of a period of Brian's life that had been largely left out of his public narrative, Carney carried the letter during the private family gathering that followed his funeral. In many respects, it was the conclusion of a circle that started when Marilyn and Brian first crossed paths as youngsters in the early years of the California Sound. Brian Wilson's musical legacy remains safe, as is the harmony that underpins the songs. Pet Sounds will always be regarded as one of the best albums ever made. Good Vibrations' groundbreaking production methods will continue to be researched. However, Marilyn Ravel's long-awaited remarks give this legacy vital context. Behind the sun-drenched harmonies, they remind us, there was a man battling problems that most of us cannot fathom, and a family caught up in the chaos of his brilliant but disturbed mind. Her choice to speak out until after his passing, and in this restricted private manner, reveals a great deal about her personality and the nuanced nature of their connection. Most people cannot access the source of Brian's music, she wrote in her letter. He could never completely live in the world that the rest of us live in as a result of that access. I pray that the musical harmony he produced has eventually made its way into his soul. Perhaps the most genuine eulogy for one of music's most significant and tortured geniuses can be found in these straightforward, sincere comments from the lady who knew him while his artistic abilities were at their peak and his personal reality was starting to fall apart. The noises that Brian Wilson produced altered our perception of the outside world. By eventually speaking forward, Marilyn Ravel Wilson has altered our perception of the man who made those noises. If this story touched you, please subscribe for more in-depth explorations of the untold stories behind the greatest legends in history. Tell us how Brian Wilson's music influenced your life in the comments below. Give your thoughts on this last moving part of his narrative.